Support comes from Mosby Building Arts, on a mission to create remodeling experiences worthy of 5-star online reviews. See the difference at callmosby.com.
This is St. Louis on the Air from St. Louis Public Radio. I'm Elaine Cha. Plants don't talk, but they're constantly interacting with the world around them. These aren't conversations, but exchanges of key resources like carbon and nitrogen. These interactions form relationships between many plants and other living things. How those relationships work and how they affect the food we rely on is one piece in the planet-sized puzzle that people like Giles Oldroyd are working on. Oldroyd is a geneticist and plant scientist. He spent decades studying the ways plants nourish themselves and the environment around them. Earlier this year, he was named the new president of the Danforth Plant Science Center. Yesterday, Giles Oldroyd sat down with St. Louis Public Radio senior environment and data reporter Kate Grumke. They talked about his career, his fascination with plants, and the challenge of climate change. Let's listen.
So, Giles, what first drew you to becoming a plant scientist?
I always had a fascination with biology and understanding how biological systems worked. And it was slightly chance I ended up working in a plant lab. But once I started working with plants, I couldn't stop. I love genetics, and plants are amazing for understanding and performing genetics, mostly because they store their genetic material in seeds that you can put in a drawer, unlike other like mammalian models where it's much harder to maintain that genetic material.
And I understand that early in your career, when you were a postdoctoral scientist, you made a discovery that then kind of laid the foundation for your career, and it's something that people are still building upon today. Could you kind of tell me the story of what that discovery was? Yeah,
so we were trying to understand how legumes, that's peas and beans, engage with beneficial bacteria. And what these bacteria do is fix nitrogen out of the air and feed it to the plant in the form of ammonia. We were trying to understand how the plant perceives those bacteria, because they're out in the soil, and the plant has to recognize the bacteria and then facilitate the colonization of the roots with those bacteria. The work I started doing in Stanford as a postdoc was trying to understand the signal transduction pathway that allows the plant to recognize these beneficial bacteria, and we call it symbiosis signaling. And myself and other people in the community have elucidated that signal transduction pathway that not just in legumes, but actually across most of the plant kingdom, this signaling pathway allows plants to recognize not just beneficial bacteria, but also beneficial fungi.
And so signaling, recognizing, is it comparable to communication? Can we think about this as a way that plants are kind of speaking with the world around them?
Yes. So, plants are communicating with their environment and recognizing signals from their environment. Obviously, it's different to us talking here, but almost certainly plants are communicating and with their environment, that's microorganisms as well as other plants, and recognizing signals from those organisms as well as, of course, other signals from the environment like heat and light, etc. And then they recognize all of those signals and respond accordingly to their environment.
And what's kind of the limits of that? Like, where are we as a scientific community, I guess, in understanding motivations of plants? Or, communication can kind of imply maybe intelligence or an inner life of a plant. So how far does this go?
We have to be careful not to put our own perceptions of human consciousness onto plants. Plants have evolved really independent of animals. But that doesn't mean that plants are not complex and that plants aren't able to perform really astonishing things. They just do it differently to what we understand as communication. So in the plant world, communication is chemical signals that they are either releasing into their environment or recognizing from other organisms in their environment that allows them to essentially communicate with those other organisms and then engage accordingly. And that engagement might be facilitating colonization by beneficial microorganisms, but it might be also blocking blocking colonization by pathogenic microorganisms.
And so you talked about nitrogen in this process, and as an agriculture reporter, nitrogen is something I hear about all the time, but I think that regular people maybe aren't as tuned in to how important that is for our food system. So why is that kind of a key thing that we pay really close attention to in agriculture?
So in agriculture, since the Green Revolution, essentially the Green Revolution allowed the widespread application of nitrogenous fertilizers. And in agriculture, nitrogen is really the biggest limitation to crop production. Nitrogen and phosphorus, those are the two main ingredients that go into fertilizers, as well as potassium, but really nitrogen and phosphorus are the biggest drivers to crop production. And so we apply those nitrogenous fertilizers, and they massively increase our crop production. And in fact, food security on the planet is completely dependent on those nitrogenous fertilizers that we apply. However, it does come with a cost. It's a cost to the farmer that's becoming a very real cost right now because nitrogenous fertilizers and the ingredients of them are limited in their transport because of what's happening in Iran. And that's driving up costs as well as limiting access to those fertilizers. But they also have environmental costs. So those nutrients that we apply to the field, they don't all get into the crop plant. Some of them escape into the environment and cause problems in the environment.
Mm-hmm. Like dead zones in the Gulf or something like that. When we live next to the Mississippi, it's something that we hear a lot about,
exactly.
Right?
Yes. So, I mean, the Mississippi is draining a vast agricultural area in the U.S., and there's a lot of nitrogenous fertilizers applied across that area. So both within the Mississippi and in the Gulf, but also in the lakes and streams that are here in Missouri, they're heavily impacted by those nutrients.
And so you said that nitrogen and phosphorus are essentially the bottlenecks in our system, right? They're something that are limiting our production. So your work was focused on how beans, right, kind of can fix nitrogen. So tell me more about why that was such an interesting mechanism to you and how we might be able to kind of apply that to other plants or some of the challenges we have.
Yeah, so legumes have evolved this amazing capability to get nitrogen out of the air. And it's because they engage with these beneficial bacteria. And bacteria are the only organisms that can use atmospheric nitrogen. And that's just two molecules of nitrogen with a triple bond between them. That's incredibly inert. We're currently breathing that nitrogen in and we breathe it out. We can't use it. And in fact, the only organisms on the planet that can use that source of nitrogen are bacteria. And they convert it to a much more reactive form of nitrogen ammonium that's released to the plant. And nitrogen's critical it's critical for us, it's critical for plants because it's a key ingredient in amino acids that make up proteins. It's a key ingredient in nucleic acids that make up DNA and RNA. So you have to have nitrogen. It's central to biological molecules. And so plants have to capture nitrogen somehow. Most plants are reliant on the levels of nitrogen present in the soil. But legumes have really evolved this amazing capability to capture nitrogen from the atmosphere. And that means that our legume crops, like soybean, we don't need to fertilize them. They grow without fertilizer. They're very productive without fertilizer. But they're also really good for the soils because they naturally enrich the soils for organic sources of nitrogen.
And so plants don't need fertilizer in the wild. Native plants don't need it, for example. So what are the consequences of us having to give it to plants?
Yeah, so in wild ecosystems, there's a whole nutrient cycle that recycles those nutrients back. So there's actually very little loss of nutrients in those wild ecosystems. But in agriculture, we're stripping off production every year, right? We harvest what we grow. And we essentially, by doing that, we're depleting the nitrogen and phosphorus from the soil. So that's why in agriculture, we have to keep adding it back and why our food systems are so dependent on that reapplication of nitrogen and phosphorus to maintain productivity in our agricultural systems.
And so this was your focus for a long time, was on kind of the science behind nitrogen fixing and the microbes in the soil that are involved in that. So how did you kind of make the jump to wanting to lead the Danforth Plant Science Center here in St. Louis?
So I've always been driven by the desire to see the research that I do and I do in my group to really drive the potential for real-world impact. And, nitrogen fixation, limited to legumes, but if we could get cereals to fix nitrogen, that's a total game changer for food production on the planet, for sustainable food production. And I would say it's that desire to see impact from the science that we do that has really brought me to the Danforth Plant Science Center. The mission of the center is to improve the human condition through plant science with an explicit focus on sustainable food security. And I think that mission is more important now than it was 27 years ago at the founding of the center. And I think that Danforth Plant Science Center is really the place to drive that impact in sustainable food security. The world needs it, and there's a huge opportunity right now to deliver it.
We need to take a quick break, but we'll be back shortly to continue this conversation with Giles Oldroyd, the new president of the Danforth Plant Science Center. He spoke yesterday with STLPR Senior Environment and Data Reporter Kate Grumke. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio.
Support comes from Gemma, architects, planners, and designers seeking to bring joy to their clients and communities. Details at gemastl.com.
Welcome back. I'm Elaine Cha. We're listening this hour to an interview with Giles Oldroyd, the new president of the Danforth Plant Science Center. He recently gave his first public speech, laying out his vision for the research nonprofit, including his optimism in the face of climate change. He spoke earlier this week with STLPR Senior Environment and Data Reporter Kate Grumke. Let's return to that conversation. Here's Kate.
I know that you all work kind of at a global level and also at a local level. So what are the differences when you think about those goals between somewhere across the globe versus what we see here in the Midwest in agriculture?
Yeah, so I separate this between what we call high-income farmers versus low-income farmers. So here in the US, we're dealing with high-income farmers that are relatively secure, although it's kind of challenging at the moment. Profitability in farming is not great. But the big issue here in the US is the sustainability of our farming systems. And that's not just a nice word to say. It actually is really critical. We've lost 50% of our topsoils in the last 100 years or so. We can't afford to just continue to do that because once we lose those topsoils, productivity declines. So it's not just a sort of, it would be nice to be sustainable. It's actually critical to be sustainable. And since the Green Revolution, the extensive use of inorganic fertilizers, a big uptick in crop protection agents, heavy tillage, these are all great for food security and for producing large amounts of food, but they're not great for the environment. And I see, the opportunity is to really transform our farming systems to something that's much more sustainable than it currently is. For a smallholder farmer in sub-Saharan Africa, it's a completely different game there. They're dealing with less than a hectare of land. They don't have access to fertilizers. Their productions are very limited. And they're generally going hand to mouth, barely able to produce enough food for themselves. In a good year, they're producing an excess of food they can sell on a market. But in a bad year, like a drought, they're not able to even produce enough for their own nutrition. So there, we're really looking at how do we raise production. Obviously, we'd like to do that sustainably, but we also have to be cognizant that we just have to help these people, some of the poorest people on the planet, produce enough food for their own consumption and ultimately produce enough that they can make a profit, like farmers here in the US, and, for instance, send their kids to school.
And you've used the term the Green Revolution a couple times. I'm not sure that everyone is typically familiar with what that refers to. So could you tell us about this history of the Green Revolution and maybe kind of, are we still on that path now, or where are we with it? Yeah,
so the Green Revolution was it was driven by Norman Borlaug, who won the Nobel Peace Prize, and it was from the 1960s. It was a combination of crop genetics, principally stunting crops, such that when you apply fertilizer to the crops before, they would grow so tall, they would just fall over. And they put a lot of the resources into the stems and the leaves. But by stunting the crops, so actually using dwarf genetics that dwarf the crops, it means you can now apply fertilizers and they don't overgrow. And actually those fertilizers go into production into the seed. So it was that combination of nitrogen prices coming down because of advances in the chemistry of chemical nitrogen fixation, alongside crop genetics. And those two things created the Green Revolution. And that really allowed the widespread application of nitrogenous fertilizers in our food production systems. And productivity has tripled to quadrupled since the 1960s in a lot of our staple crops. And that's in part because of the Green Revolution, but also all the future genetics and agronomic practices that came into place after that.
Yeah, if you look at a yield graph, for example, in the U.S., I think I looked at one of corn in the last year, and it's just a steady increase. Like, we have done incredible things to get more food out of the same amount of land, essentially.
Exactly, yes. We've seen a tripling to quadrupling of most of our staple crops. That's happened in high-income countries. Hasn't happened for smallholder farmers at all. They haven't experienced that productivity gains that we in high income countries like the US have seen in the last 60 years. But yeah, those productivity gains have been instrumental in feeding an expanding population and essentially allowing an expansion of the middle classes to, change their diets. And all of that's happened without people noticing particularly, but the innovations that's been happening in plant science and in agriculture has been phenomenal.
And do you see yourself as kind of part of that legacy of Norman Borlaug?
I would hope that what I want to see is the next Green Revolution. And even Norman Borlaug said this was a temporary fix. It solved the food security problem, but he already recognized the environmental consequences of it. And he saw it as a temporary fix. And now is the time for the second Green Revolution. And that Green Revolution needs to be a sustainable Green Revolution. How do we sustainably exist on this planet? Because we can't afford, our children and our grandchildren are going to suffer the consequences if we don't address it now.
Yeah, so what would a modern Green Revolution look like?
So what we see right now in our agricultural systems is our fertility of our soils is declining. We're mining those soils. And mostly what that means is erosion, losing a lot of soil as we plow the land. We lose a lot of soil to the air in a windstorm or into the rivers and streams when it rains. But also when we plow the land, we oxygenate the soil and all the microorganisms in that soil start to respire. And when they respire, they eat the carbon and convert it to carbon dioxide, which goes up into the atmosphere. So we're essentially losing the carbon from our soil either into our rivers or up into the atmosphere. And none of that is a good thing. We need to turn that around and farm in a way that actually builds the soil fertility rather than declining the soil fertility. And there's already a lot of innovations happening. No-till agriculture is really moving forwards. That means you farm without plowing, so you're not disturbing the land. That's really important, not to till. It's really the best thing you can do for your soil, right? It's just to leave it stable, in a stable form. But that transforms how we approach our agriculture. And then also not leaving the soil bare over the winter, having living roots in the soil that hold the soil in its place and stops that. So cover crops over the winter. Those are fantastic for improving soil fertility. But there's also, an extreme version of this called regenerative agriculture, where you're really incorporating all of these principles and you convert your farming systems to one that builds soil fertility rather than declining soil fertility. This is what I'm really excited about. And there's huge opportunities for us to actually really transform the way we do our farming and convert it into a much more sustainable form of farming than what we currently have.
And how much of that do you think would come down to practices versus the actual crops that we're planting and growing?
Just like the Green Revolution, it's a combination of both. So, for instance, you're not plowing the land. That transforms how a farmer works if they're not plowing the land, right? That's a radically different thing to do. But when you don't plow the land, you need different crops that work in those systems. So we've been breeding our crops for the intensive agricultural systems we currently have, which is highly tilled, so highly plowed, lots of chemical inputs, so inorganic fertilizers, crop protection agents. If we want to switch to a more sustainable farming system, we need our crops to do all of that work instead of relying on those inputs. So, for instance, nitrogen fixation, better use of beneficial bacteria and beneficial fungal associations that can deliver those nutrients, both nitrogen and phosphorus, to the plant in a more sustainable manner, but also crops that perform well in systems where you're not tilling. And, of course, developing cover crops. That's a new initiative. So completely new crops that we can grow over winter and keep the soil from being lost or eroded over the winter. All of these require innovations in plant science, but the opportunities are immense right now. I'm super excited. I think we can really transform our agricultural systems, and I'm very excited about those opportunities.
I'm talking with plant scientist Giles Oldroyd. In February, he was named the president of the Danforth Plant Science Center. And so you recently had this big talk that you gave, your first public address as president of the Danforth Center, and you talked a lot about climate change and how plant science might help us kind of adapt to a warmer future. So why is that such an important issue to focus on in your work?
Well, climate change impacts agriculture immensely, right? I mean, the crops are sitting out in the field, and when it gets to 100 degrees Fahrenheit here in St. Louis, the crops have to survive. We go into air conditioning, but the crops have to sit there and survive. And, you know, the heat extremes that we're seeing right now are going to feel cool by 2050. So it's not stopping yet, and we don't really know where we stabilize in that climate change. So if we don't adapt now, we're going to find ourselves, even here in America, feeling the pinch of food security because our crops will start to fail. So we really need to adapt our crops to a new climate, and we have to do that now. Our agriculture is one of the most prone systems to climate change, and we can't stand still because the climate is changing.
And we've talked a lot about kind of a Midwestern or North American perspective on that, but what do you think is necessary globally, and especially in lower resource areas of the planet?
Yeah, so, you know, many people, the poorest people on the planet, don't have the food security that we take for granted. And most of them are smallholder farmers, so they're dependent on the productivity from their land, but they're sitting in regions of the planet that are particularly exposed to climate change within the tropics. So, you know, those farmers already are barely producing enough. And they're looking forwards with climate change. They're very poorly positioned. We need to address that. And the best way to address that is to ensure that, A, they're producing the appropriate levels of food. And that's an opportunity that we can absolutely address. But also that their crops are future-proofed. Just like our crops need to be future-proofed, their crops also need to be future-proofed. But in essence, if a farmer here in a good year makes an excess and gets a good income, and that helps them survive along with insurance to cover crises in their farming systems. For a smallholder farmer in Africa, they don't have insurance, and even in a good year, they're producing poorly, so they never create that insurance for a bad year. We should maximize production when it's a good year, when they have the rains and they can produce. We need to maximize that production because it gives them the insurance for the times when it is a bad year. And there's only so much you can do. If it's an absolute drought, you know, a crop's going to fail. So, you know, there's only so much we can do, but we can certainly make our crops much more resilient than they currently are, as well as improving some very resilient crops like millets. They're super drought and heat tolerant already. We can make those crops be much more productive, so they're actually useful crops, or even better crops for those low-income farmers.
Yeah, we hear about Kernza a lot from the Danforth Center, right? Is that kind of something that you think about for especially drought resilience?
Well, Kernza is a perennial wheat. It's like a perennial wheat. So I see that much more as a driving sustainability in our farming systems here in the Midwest, because with the perennial crops, that means it's not an annual crop. You're not planting them every year. That's great for a no-till system. So perennial wheat would be a game changer for the sustainability of our farming system. But, you know, it's a crop that would be grown in the more temperate regions. It's not necessarily a crop that we'd expect smallholder farmers in Africa to be growing.
And in the last year or so, I have spoken to a lot of scientists, not at the Danforth Center specifically, but across the Midwest, who are dealing with a really new climate, especially politically, when it comes to federal funding for science, the types of science that they're able to conduct, and even how they talk about their work publicly. And I'm wondering how you feel that is impacting the Danforth Center at all, and kind of what the, especially partnership with federal government agencies like the National Science Foundation is going to look like for Danforth moving forward.
Yeah, so it is impacting us. So we've seen a drop in our funding from last year to this year from the federal government. And the federal government is our number one funder for the research that we do at the Danforth Center. So that's really a significant impact. It means our research base is shrinking right now. And I don't think that's a good thing. We have huge opportunities and challenges in our agricultural systems, and we need to be on the front foot to drive those changes globally, both in the US but also in some of the more poor regions of the planet. I don't feel happy coming in as a president, seeing this shrinkage, but I also recognize that, the reason that the Danforth Center is here is because of the generosity of the community. It's a philanthropic community that's made it a possibility. And I see the opportunity to reach out to the philanthropic community to help us drive the impact that we want to have.
Yeah, and what's your pitch to them when you're thinking about why it's beneficial to have something like the Danforth Center in St. Louis?
Well, plant science in St. Louis is amazing. It's really a world leader, and that's why I've come all the way from the UK and left the University of Cambridge to take the presidency here at the Danforth Center. St. Louis is a fantastic place for plant science. It's a really exciting environment, both the private sector and the public sector. And it's an opportunity for St. Louis to grow the region, because ag tech is already, and going forwards almost certainly will be, a major driver of our local economy. And beyond that, beyond just helping the St. Louis region grow, I think there's something fundamental to driving sustainable food security across the planet. It's not just a wish, it's necessary. And if we don't do it, then what is the planet going to look like for our children and our grandchildren? And the planet is changing dramatically. We need to adapt, and I don't think we can rely entirely on the federal funding landscape to drive those transformative changes that we need.
And then I'm wondering, on a personal level, too, what has it been like to move to St. Louis? You said you've been here for 6 months. So how has this change been for you coming internationally?
I found St. Louis extremely welcoming. I've really appreciated the community here, and I love the Danforth Center and the new job I'm doing. It's an interesting environment to be an immigrant. I would say I don't feel particularly welcomed at the country level as an immigrant. However, I feel incredibly welcomed within the St. Louis community, and people are very happy for me to be here, but also for going out of their way to make me feel welcome. I'm really appreciative to St. Louis. I think the community undersells St. Louis. The people sort of always apologizing for St. Louis, and I don't think there's anything to apologize for. It's a fantastic city and an exciting place to be.
I totally agree. So is there any kind of final thought that you have about what you're looking forward to in this new role?
So for me, it's reiterating that point on impact. We have to change our food production systems. We cannot stand still. And the change is global. And I believe the Danforth Center is the place to drive that global change. And that's why I'm here.
That was Giles Oldroyd, the new president of the Donald Danforth Plant Science Center. He spoke with STLPR senior environment and data reporter Kate Grumke.
This episode was produced by Danny Wissentowski.
Audio engineering and podcast design by Aaron Dorr.
Our executive producer is Alex Hoyer.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations, and leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thank you.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
The Gateway brings you the day's news each weekday from around the St. Louis region and the state capitals in Jefferson City.
Our schools are accredited. We don't need this bill.
And Springfield.
How many more years must pass before lawmakers see time is of the essence?
I'm Abby Larico. Join me each weekday for The Gateway on the STLPR app or wherever you get podcasts.